see you. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, I count on you to take over the questions.
It's counting on you.
And we will have two people on the screen to make sure all those links are working. So Jane, whenever it's possible to get everyone up, okay. Okay. All right. Now we're all here in one form or another. Okay. So in this panel, we're going to be talking about China and related issues. So supply chain disruptions and shifts in global politics have created changes in the business model of designed in America and made in China that's become so common. Is that model sustainable, or will comparative advantage outweigh other concerns, such as national security? If a new approach is necessary, what should it be? How can we ensure that government actions regarding supply chains help move us towards an efficient, sustainable model, rather than one determined by who lobbies the hardest? And we've got a great group of people to talk about that today. I'll give very brief intros, and we'll start the conversation. So we have Austin Carson, who's there on the screen. He is the founder and president of Seed AI. Previously, he established and led the DC Government Affairs Office of Operations for NVIDIA, translating NVIDIA's expertise in artificial intelligence and high-performance computing for policymakers. And prior to that, he was legislative director for Chairman Michael McCowell, executive director for Tech Freedom. He also co-founded the Congressional Tech Staff Association and worked a lot on the CHIPS Act, which we will talk about. Then we have Brad Jensen to my left. Brad is the McCrane Shaker Chair in International Business at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His recent work examines the relationship between trade and firm performance and the impact of trade and services on the economy. Xiaoming Liu, to Brad's left, is a senior analyst in Eurasia Group's geotechnology practice, where she focuses on the interactions of emerging technologies with geopolitics, market dynamics, and regulatory norms. Before joining the Eurasia Group, she was the China practice lead at the consulting firm Access Partnership. And in this capacity, she helped top financial and cloud service providers of the US enter China's market. And Sam Sachs, on the screen, is senior fellow at Yale Law School, at Paul Tsai China Center, and cyber policy fellow, New America Foundation. Her research focuses on emerging information and communication technology policies globally, particularly in China. She's worked on Chinese tech policy issues for over a decade, both with the US government and in the private sector. So welcome, all of you. So let's start with this kind of underlying question. How is great power competition between the US and China different from the Cold War? And how is this likely to influence policy choices across a range of issues? Brad, why don't you start with that? And I should note that this question might sound very coherent because Brad wrote it. So the surprise question, Brad.
Thanks, Scott, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. So I think a big difference between now and the Cold War was that the US and the Soviet Union had very little economic interaction. Right? There were basically two distinct economic spheres. So the levers, the policy levers in the economic space for either to influence the other were quite limited. The United States and China, on the other hand, are both deeply integrated into the global economy in terms of trade, in terms of investment, in terms of innovation, and in terms of finance. Right? So a broader set of policy tools, economic policy tools, are available to both governments to try to influence the other's behavior. We saw this with the Trump administration's trade war, where tariffs were the economic policy tool that received the most media attention. And that tool is still being used by the Biden administration. However, there were a much broader range of tools that were being used at this time, and Fiona Murray mentioned some of them in her remarks. Right, so in terms of foreign direct investment, the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, that process was modernized. The Foreign Investment Review Reform Modernization Act, FIRMA, right, was passed as legislation in the past 5 years with a direct eye toward constraining China's ability to invest in the United States. Export controls were also reformed and broadened significantly the number of technologies that are considered within the domain of the Export Control Act. In addition, and I don't think, I was not aware of this certainly, that there's something called deemed exports. Right? And so the list broadens, so it's not just hardware anymore, but it's things like algorithms, right, or processes. And if you have an employee who's a foreign national, either in the United States or perhaps working at an affiliate of yours in a foreign country, who comes to the US and is exposed to some of these technologies, that is a deemed export. And that is in violation of the Export Control Act. So if you think about a global innovation system that many large US multinationals have, right, this is going to be an impediment to global innovation. Another policy tool, the Entity List and Huawei. That has created a lot of disruption in the semiconductor value chain. Right? It's not just people who sell directly to Huawei, but it's anybody who sells to anybody who sells to Huawei. Last, visas and international students in the United States. That is also, there's sand in the gears on that. So all of these policy tools have the prospect of increasing uncertainty in the policy environment that firms face. This is going to decrease investment.
Xiaopeng?
Sure, I would fully agree with Brad in the sense that US, China today are much more integrated in the global economy than the Soviet Union and US during the Cold War. And this type of integration certainly provides a buffer for global conflicts and tension. And a lot of this economic independence is deeply rooted in the business transaction, mostly driven by private sector players. So when there's peak in global tension, geopolitical conflict, you see this pull and push between public sector and private sector players. And we talked about this already many times this morning. CFIUS is a classic example. The FIRMA expansion of CFIUS regimes broaden the scope of the investment review, inbound investment review, to consider sensitive data as part of its review scope, as well as real estate that may have national security implications. I think today, CFIUS officials is still trying to figure out what that really means, how do they implement this part, but that's definitely a step in the direction where you'll see the conflict of state power and the connected tissue of globalization mostly created and promoted by the business community. And, but I think it's also important to note that there's further potential expansion of FIRMA regime being contemplated on Capitol Hill. Even the original FIRMA included the outbound investment review mechanism that kind of put all the investment deals on the table for a lot of the security interests of US government to look at and to provide their opinion, if not make a decision of whether those deals can go through. And this type of language resurfaced in the Compete Act and US ICA Act that was hotly debated on Capitol Hill a month ago. Today, the CHIPS Plus Act has been passed, and that part of most aggressive type of expansion proposal has been eliminated. So today, we don't have that in the CHIPS Plus Act. It wasn't part of the bill that's signed by President Biden last week, but still the debate is still going on. The reason why so far the language keep being proposed and get pushed back is the business community really cares about this part of the regulatory regime. I think the inbound investment flow that has a significant impact on major Chinese deals in the US, whether that's a proposed acquisition of Grindr or that's Alibaba's attempt to buy MoneyGram. Both of those high-profile deals got turned down because the trend to expand inbound investments associated with potential foreign adversaries like China and Russia stakeholders. But for outbound investment renewal, that has direct impact on company headquartered here. Some of the big major corporations in the tech space, I think that's why you see this pull and push dynamic in the past few years. And so far, I would say the business community is winning to a certain extent. I think that's a very interesting example where you see this dynamic playing out, and it will continue to unfold in the next few years. I think another more mature economic tool Brad just mentioned also is export control, because this is something that's more customer focused than human resource focused or capital focused. And this very much target on the buyers of US technology. And so far, we have seen the policy trend in this category moving forward more steadily, carrying out the Trump administration initiative into the Biden years. And even you can argue on one hand, there's precision targeting. They are really narrowing down the type of Chinese companies they want to put on entity list. And in another sense, they're expanding this tool as well. Because compared to, for example, delisting Chinese companies in the US stock market or fully expand the CFIUS review to outbound investment or put a more wholesale ban on immigration from foreign countries. This one comparatively has less impact on US industry. Even the suppliers of Chinese companies that get on entity list, whether that's justifiable or not, will say otherwise. But comparatively, this is a slightly more narrow type of tool U.S. government has imposed. I think the success of this type of export control policy making trend is also speak to the lack of real economic policy and trade progress in the past few years. Between US and China, there's bilateral trade dialogue called JCCT that was ongoing for almost 30 years, but during Trump administration, it broke down, and Biden administration couldn't really revive that given the tense bilateral tension. But though that type of dialogue, it's very much trade focused and economic focused. It's a little bit a process for both sides to communicate and register complaint and make compromise. But at the end of that 30 years, I think this type of economic tool has broken down quite a bit. That's why the US government got so frustrated about China's unfair business practice and policy actions. They switched to this tool called export control that was originally designed for nuclear weapons. And so that's what they found effective. So they keep going, and the momentum keeps building. I think that's something that's really interesting. And
I mean, it sounds like there are more tools, more ways to interact, but I mean, the economic effects then seem to be potentially much larger than in the Cold War. Setting aside people worrying about nuclear war, do you think people here aren't sufficiently concerned, given the possible stakes?
I think there's that group of people constantly voicing their concern.
Mm-hmm.
That's why you see the expansion of export control sort of take 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and every step they take forward, there's a lot of internal discussion, a lot of industry resistance to this. I think maybe in 5, 10 years, ideally, if I put my optimistic head on my head, I think maybe eventually they will realize some of the, for example, AI companies they put on entity list, their application is not going to end up have any military implication. Maybe later on, once their technology is more mature, you go into the deployment stage, they realize they overreacted. But I think right now the political environment just doesn't allow that type of conversation to happen.
Brad, you wanted to?
Yeah, I just think the political economy around support for China within the U.S. has changed over the last 20 or 30 years. There is all the concerns, that were voiced when permanent normal trade relations was passed, and with China's accession to the WTO, all the concerns that were expressed then have only grown. And I think the hopes of both the national security side and the business side from bringing China into the global trading system have been diminished in terms of, behavior in Hong Kong, South China Sea. All the national security concerns are larger. The business community has made a lot of money in China, but nowhere near as much as they hoped. So I think that, there's not as much push to keep things on an even keel.
Interesting. Sam, you wanted to weigh on this as well.
I think that the point about economic interconnectivity is an important one. And in many ways, it's why the types of tools that Brad and Xiaomeng have mentioned, the policy infrastructure that has been proposed, from export controls to supply chain security reviews, to potential outbound foreign investment screening, all of these sort of the rhetoric of sort of Cold War style policy tools, I think we haven't seen them implemented to their full effect, not just because of pushback from the business community, but because I think there's also a recognition from policymakers as well that if these tools are taken to their full effect, the economic consequences, as well as some of the consequences for U.S. technological leadership, are actually going to be a really significant factor, and that there may be costs associated with that, right? So, Brad mentioned the idea of algorithms as a deemed export. I think it's not surprising that when we think about some of the proposals around, for example, creating categories of types of technologies like AI as subject to export controls, we haven't actually seen that take effect in full force, because what does that even mean to make AI something that is subject to an export control, right? How do you create code from crossing borders, and what would be the economic consequences of doing so? The other tool that has been put in place, in the midnight hour of the Trump administration, we had the ICTS rule, which gives the Commerce Secretary broad discretion to review all and ban transactions that are quote unquote threats to digital economy and US national security. What does that even mean? So I think it's interesting that tool caused a lot of concern in the business community, but it was never implemented because I think the Commerce Department itself realized that they didn't have the resources to review every type of transaction with no real clear parameters about what that would mean and what the costs would be associated with that. And in many ways, some of those tools actually mirror the sort of opaque nature of China's own domestic regulatory system, which has caused headaches for multinationals for years. The second point that I want to make, which I think is somewhat less talked about, right? We talk about the interconnectivity as being a really important difference with the Cold War. The second point that I think is under the radar and needs to be brought into the conversation is who benefits from a Cold War narrative, right? There are certain companies that have used national security as a guise of protectionism at a moment when I think there are the difference between the Cold War and now is that China has real economic competitors to the US. There are companies that for the first time, for example, Meta and TikTok. I think it's sort of well known in policy circles in Washington that Meta has been part of cultivating the national security threat narrative around TikTok. Now, are there real national security issues that need to be grappled with? Absolutely. Questions about data access, around types of algorithms that are being put forward and the implications for online content. So those are real national security issues. I think we have the tools to manage those and to address them. But one thing I think we should be wary of is where has the Cold War narrative been latched onto and used as a form of protectionism to push out foreign competitors?
That's actually comes to another question. Austin, let's get to you just a minute because nobody knows more about the CHIPS Act and so on than you, so hold tight. But Sam, how much of the anti-China sentiment is based on real concerns, security, human rights? I mean, it's a country with basically concentration camps. And how much is protectionism and how much is jingoism? Can we even separate those, and does it matter?
Look, I think there are real national security, real human rights issues in China. I mean, the Xinjiang situation is atrocious. And so how do we think about how to solve these problems in a way that is, one, in the strategic interest of the US, and two, actually put in place tools when we think about Xinjiang, for example, that actually help the Uyghurs. I think that the Uyghur issue has been used very cynically in a way that puts in place tools that may be shortcuts to decoupling, but don't actually help the Uyghurs. So I would argue for a need to kind of reframe that conversation. Is the regime under Xi Jinping moving in a increasingly autocratic direction, repressive in ways that are at odds with open markets and free flow of information, democracy? Absolutely. So the question is, what are the policy tools that are going to make the US more secure, maintain US technological leadership? And I think those are the questions we need to look at when we look at the tools that are in play. I think that we always are going in the right direction when policy is focused on how can the US run faster? How do we play offense rather than just defense? And so the CHIPS Act, I think there's a lot of important questions to be raised around what is the role of public-private partnerships and industry, so we don't mirror China's industrial policy. But I think any conversation that looks at these real problems posed by China from the perspective of offense and how do we focus on US strengths of openness and the dynamism are the right ways to think about these questions. One of the sort of tools that the former Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, had talked about, a small yard, high fence. You are selective about what you want to protect and aggressive about protecting it. And I think that there was a lot of buzz around this when the Biden administration first came in because it's a compelling concept. The challenge is what actually goes inside the yard, right? How do we create, and I think that the export controls, for example, have run into a lot of obstacles when we get in this mentality of creating lists of broad categories of technology. So there would be some obvious candidates, quantum or nuclear security, for example, but I think we get into a much more difficult zone when it comes to software and AI and these things. And so it's no wonder that some of these tools have hit a wall. And again, that's why we really need to focus on how do we run faster? How do we create incentives around our own R&D system? And think about the fact that the competition between the US and China is not going to play out as much in each other's countries, but it's going to be playing out in these third country markets around the world. And how do we put in place tools that will make American firms better able to outcompete in these third markets?
So every time we read about companies trying to change supply chains, the government trying to encourage that. But if you look at the data, there's been no change in imports and exports to and from China and the U.S. So first, okay, so that was Brad is waggling his head, which is what I was going to go first there. What is is that right, and what happens when you include services and so on? And well, then I have a follow-up to that, but Brad, go ahead, because you had instant reaction, so that's good.
Well, you say that nothing's changed. I mean, I don't think there's been a dramatic falling off the cliff. But if you look at Chinese imports as a share of GDP, it peaked around 2.6, 2.7% in 2015, and now it's around 2%.
That's a big change.
So, again, not falling off a cliff, but I think it's just this, you talk to companies and they say, yeah, we're still making money in China, but we're not going to invest more there because it's just, we don't know what's going to happen. And I think it's like PNTR in reverse, right? When we gave China permanent normal trade relations, the tariff codes, nothing changed, just the uncertainty went away. So businesses made big investments. Now it's just uncertainty's on, so people are going to invest less, and that's going to slow growth.
Okay, so
Innovation.
I want to get to the CHIPS Act because that's the biggest thing that's been happening right now. But I think the way you phrase that is interesting because when we think about free trade having benefits and that increased trade is one of them, and if it's in reverse, then that's a cost, right?
Absolutely.
And so it seems to me anything the government does to try to affect supply chains is going to lead to a less efficient outcome, just by its nature. But that might be totally fine given all the horrible things in China. And do we have any sense of the kind of costs that we're willing to take on to meet these other goals?
I think the conversation's just starting about how much are we willing to pay.
I want a dollar figure.
And next, invite me back. I don't think we know. I don't know if.
Right. I mean, it's sort of more of a rhetorical question, I guess. But
Yeah.
maybe for the other panelists, I mean,
Yeah.
what sort of costs have you seen so far in companies trying to change supply chains?
I guess a slightly older example at this point, like during the trade wars, both U.S. China imposed tariffs on each other, and a lot of companies have reorganized their supply chain to adjust to that new reality. I think a lot of the hardware electronic company have done that to diversify their supply chain to mitigate that risk. Does that make the most economic sense? Probably not.
Mm-hmm.
But will this new paradigm of supply chain distribution stay? I think for sure.
Just want to remind people, you can still ask questions on Slido, and we'll get to questions. Okay, so the CHIPS Act is probably the biggest, the best example of all of this, and it was just passed recently. And Austin, it would be great if you could tell us a little bit about it and its implications, since you
Sure.
have so much experience with it.
Well, hopefully this doesn't disappoint because most of my experience was on the plus part, but I can tell you a little bit about the CHIPS part. I mean,
Yeah.
so, first of all, even with $52 billion, you're only going to cover a portion of the capital expenditure that companies are going to have to make to build fabs in the United States. And for anybody that's not familiar, part of the issue with the broader question is that the most leading edge technology is pretty much not captured is the wrong word, but centralized in the capabilities of TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor. And obviously there's a concern, I can't imagine why, but the hope was that given especially the increased conflict that we could have something approaching leading edge node in the United States. Now, for the question of like ultimate national security concerns, it's going to be a period of time until we have a setup where were something to happen in China and Taiwan, we would be able to make up for the production that we would otherwise be able to get. Now, with this as a mechanism to move forward, I think the overall kind of existential concern is decreased because you're seeing progress. Samsung is expanding, TSMC is expanding, Intel is expanding. Now with chips, you're still talking about fab construction. So for companies like NVIDIA, AMD, Qualcomm, there's not the same benefits. So you do have a bit of a reordering in terms of the industry, since even the ones that do fabricate compete in other levels with the other companies. So that's a bit of market distortion that some are concerned about. But when it comes to the plus part, the huge investments in NSF, DOE, in commerce, and to what Sam is saying, hitting the gas, I do think that that's very exciting. I think that we will benefit from having additional semiconductor capacity, just given the fact that we're not going to see a slowdown in the need for semiconductors anytime soon, especially we're adding AI at the edge at a much greater rate. We're pretty much adding some type of inferencing capability on most devices that are internet connected in the not too distant future. But the ability for us to hit the gas and to do so in a way that, also to Sam's point, is not the command and control top-down Chinese system, but one based upon very regionally oriented partnerships based upon, being anchored in academic institutions or nonprofits, with a focus on maximizing our kind of creative potential regardless of geography or socioeconomics. I think that's also very powerful. And so if you look at the overall investment bill, you see the $52 billion coming down for supporting the CapEx or offloading some of the CapEx for fab construction. And then moving beyond that, it's like, you know, back to the prior point of export controls, there's two things. The first is how much of it is kind of bleak economic in nature. It seems like a lot, right? The second part of it is, you know, if we are going to truly be competitive, it's about being internally competitive as much as possible so that the products and services and the dynamism, the creation of new businesses can really amp up and in ways that we don't see with the heavy concentration in a small number of urban areas on the coast. So we've seen some disaggregation over the last, since 2018. I think in 2018, the vast majority of all tech job creation was in 5 cities. And then now that's expanded out per new Brookings report, but that is going to be, I think, the true secret to our success. We're gonna have investments in new semiconductor technologies themselves, which could lead to new fabrication processes. And beyond that, you're going to have a ton of new applications of artificial intelligence, new novel models. And again, just another point on export controls, it's so nonsensical to think about just AI as like a category to be covered in general. I mean, we are having a greater specificity, but I think a lot of people here will remember PGP getting shipped across the Atlantic on a book. And when it comes to different algorithms, I don't know what we're going to do about it. But that's my long and short. I mean, feel free to jump in there.
Well, actually, I mean, I want to come back also to Taiwan and its role, because I know Xiaomeng has thoughts on that. But take us, if you can, into the room when they were talking about chips, when they were developing it. Is there a sense that we learned anything from Sematech? And honestly, people still debate what we should have learned from it. Or did people come at it as if, hey, this is a brand new idea. We've never thought of this before. I mean, was there sort of a sense of history in that we tried this before and we should learn from it?
I mean, there was certainly some concern about Sematech, right? Mm-hmm. There was some concern that we were going to go in a more top-down direction. It's not quite the same everybody come together on a singular initiative as much as it is still disaggregated and not based upon only US entities, right? Like the ability for like TSMC and Samsung to expand as ones that are currently, I mean, Intel, I believe in you guys, you can pull it off, but are currently the ones that have leading edge node. I think that that's important. And again, I think the ability to distribute the geographic impact of the investments is also important.
Xiaomeng, do you have thoughts on the role of Taiwan in all of this?
Yes, like Austin just mentioned, I think TSMC is Taiwan's high-tech crown jewel. This company, one entity, produces more than 90% of the most advanced chips in the world, that including chips used for the newest iPhones and high-end telco equipment and high-end servers and AI applications. All that, I think that's why this company is right now very much at the forefront of geopolitical conflicts and industrial policy, considering what if a military conflict breaks out in the next few years. Right now, Eurasia Group's estimate of this risk taking place in the next 3 years is about 35%. If you go forward through 2028, that go up to 55%. If you go to 2035, we estimate the probability of some kind of military engagement from low level to large-scale military conflict altogether is about 80%. So we think the risk is only going up. And right now, TSMC is at a very, very interesting spot. So the company basically has more than a dozen factories, fabs, around the Taiwan island. And if you have visited Taiwan, the island is a very mountainous area. There's only very few flat spots where you can place large size factories in. And those are likely to become the landing spot of a Chinese PLA military campaign if a war breaks out. So right now TSMC, I think, is running into the conundrum if the firm somehow move its most advanced technology probability to Western allies, Japan, Europe, or US, mostly likely into the US at this point, given the CHIPS Act incentive, then it slightly reduce the so-called silicon shield effect of the company, because the firm possess such advanced technology to a certain extent, it acts as a deterrent to Chinese military aggression and attraction for US military to intervene in case military conflict escalate. But if you move some of that capacity over to the US, this effect just get reduced over time, and that's not what the Taiwanese government wants to see. I think internally there's a lot of back and forth between these stakeholders to decide what makes the most commercial sense, what make the most strategic sense. And also if you consider the top players in the industry, TSMC number 1, Samsung number 2, Intel number 3. If TSMC doesn't make this insurance of their top-notch technology in the US, a war breakthrough, then Samsung may become number 1 in the world. I think that's another level of calculation. It's a very complex geopolitical scenario they are grappling with, but I think it's also fascinating to see what type of choice the major tech companies and biggest government in the world will make in this case.
And
Yeah, one quick question.
Go ahead,
follow-up
go
on that,
ahead.
Actually, if I can.
Yeah.
Have has the Eurasia Group done any estimation of the change in probability if TSMC's capacity moves to the US, or if, we no longer, as we the US, require TSMC? Because that's always been a deep concern of mine on the same level.
Yeah, I think our estimate is that it has some side effect, maybe a minor element in the US consideration, because I think overall this is a sovereign issue. China draw a right line and saying Taiwan is part of us. Really, how does the tension elevates, and if any security crisis takes place, I think the driving factor is really between Chinese decision makers and the Taiwanese decision makers as well, the lawmakers and decision makers in Washington. I think it's mostly driven by the sovereign discussion. Semiconductor is part of it, but it's a secondary factor in the whole discussion.
We'll start doing questions in a minute. But we've talked about this mostly from the US side. And of course, there could be a panel in China having this exact same discussion, the upside down. Maybe that's too harsh, but what is China's reaction to all of this? I mean, I know some of you study China and what Chinese leaders think and how they react. And it's not like they're just sitting there doing nothing. And they also, in fact, have had their own CHIPS Act. I don't know what it was called, right?
Yeah.
But they've tried to subsidize that. Tell us more, maybe Sam and Xiaoming in particular, about how this is playing out in Chinese policy.
And Sam probably have more
All right, Sam.
insights into this.
I was going to say, Xiaomeng, you go ahead.
Okay, right here. I don't think China has any good immediate policy options at this point. If you look at CFIUS, China already blocked foreign firms' access to a good portion of Chinese market in terms of cloud services or online content providers, and at this point, I think their options are very limited in terms of finding an equivalent tit-for-tat CFIUS-like policy tool. And in terms of export control, I think it has been an incredibly painful experience for the Chinese policymakers as well as their national champions. I think their reaction, immediate reaction, is they're building a legal regime that's somewhat similar to the export control system in the US. They published an export control law last year, also did a very long white paper outlining China's methodology, motivations behind putting forward this whole policy regime to potentially counter US export control measures. But in reality, that will take a long time to materialize, because China essentially doesn't have the technology to create those leverage. The words is on paper, but the tools can't be activated because they don't have substance behind it. I think that's their major challenge. But nonetheless, they are sort of kind of improving their tools in the toolbox, or I don't know, like my coworker said, girding the lion to get ready for a future retaliatory action when the technology matures. That's their long-term reaction. Also, I think another long-term reaction is China's tech self-reliance drive. I talk about, I think in the aftermath of US export restriction imposed on Huawei, they realized that they need something of their own. The particular type of chips act motivation. I think you also see that in Beijing. They want their indigenous technology in order to protect themselves in case TSMC get takeover and they run out of supply of the most critical technology components in the supply chain. I think that's their long-term reaction to this. If they take any short-term reaction, put US companies on their entity list, their unreliable entity list, that's a name and shame public relation-facing retaliatory tool you could argue they could use, but they definitely shoot themselves in the foot in terms of poisoning foreign environment. And they understand, officials in Beijing understand the business community who are still doing business in China amid the challenging situation are China's best friend. You don't want to further alienate that community at this point. I think the short-term answer is that they don't have a good option, but they have a long-term plan to deal with this in the next decade or so.
To Xiaomeng's point about doubling down on indigenous capacity, for over a decade, the Chinese government has put in place policy and regulatory measures around this concept of secure and controllable, 安全可控, the idea that foreign components and software are a source of vulnerability. And I think that to the early days of the Trump administration, we've just seen the leadership double down on this concept. The thing that's interesting to me is that I think rhetorically, we've heard a doubling down on secure and controllable indigenous development as a national security risk. But on the ground, while the operating environment will always be very difficult and some would argue hostile to foreign firms, I think that reality is we haven't actually seen the Chinese government deploy some of these tools in as far-reaching a way, maybe in some ways similar to in Washington. There's been a sort of backstop against how far policymakers are willing to go. And think about the unreliable entities list was a tool that was floated when Huawei was put on the entity list, particularly when the foreign direct product rule and the concept of extraterritorial export controls would be implemented. Even potentially at one point, the question was around, would TSMC be subject to these rules, and really cut off the lifeline of supply to Huawei, even when Taiwan and TSMC was potentially in the crosshairs of this sort of third country export control regime. The Chinese government still did not deploy the tools of the unreliable entity list. You had a MOFCOM blocking rule, an anti-sanctions law, all of which would have exacted cost on the foreign business community in China, but they didn't do it. And I took note of that because I think it suggests that there still is, and particularly now with economic pressure only intensifying around the zero COVID policy, I think that there is a real wariness of the leadership to push the foreign business community too far. That doesn't mean that that's off the table. And I think the question is, will that fragile status quo that allows for multinationals to operate in that environment maintain? What could upset that delicate status quo?
I've heard U.S. multinationals talk about a degree of sophistication among Chinese regulators where they adjust, almost like a dial, adjust the domestic content requirements. Where if there's no indigenous capacity, they reserve 20% for indigenous firms. And they allow foreign firms to provide the rest. And then as soon as there's some indigenous capacity, they adjust the dial. And that's where, so you're in there, you're making money, but you see that you're going to get closed out eventually. And I think that, so it's totally consistent with what Sam, say, the writing's on the wall, but it's not right now.
We're just about out of time. There's really interesting questions on Slido. I'm just going to read them, and somebody has pick what you want to answer, so we can at least just get something about them here. So, when we think about federal R&D, how much do we not know about China's involvement? How do we identify it and cut it off? Is CHIPS actually big enough to shift incentives, given the business problems that Intel faces and the significant CapEx investments TSMC already makes? Are the Biden administration and Xi administrations trying to renew bilateral communications with a meeting soon? There were some headlines that might happen. And to what extent is U.S. policy predicated on misreading China's innovation system, including tech competence? Are we carried away by our own rhetoric? And any reaction to the announcement of the Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation? I'm not sure I know what announcement that is. But anybody want to take on any of those things I just read off at blazing speed?
I'll say something about CHIPS and the significance of it in comparison to the amount of CapEx required. I mean, they're definitely correct in that it's going to cover a small percentage of the overall required CapEx. A fab is very expensive. It's very dirty. It takes a long time to put together and get operating, and it requires a highly skilled workforce, right? So those are all challenges. But I think, even if it costs, $20 billion, $50 billion, if you're doing something really impressive over time, you're still going to ultimately see a big change with $3 billion, right? Like, it's not like $3 billion is just, coins in the hat, even though it is a smaller percentage than you would hope. And I think you can see, regardless of how political it was in nature, I mean, I don't think there's any ambiguity about the announcements that were made by companies, the investments that have been declared and begun, groundbreaking on facilities. And then for the sake of, Intel moved to more of a foundry, to operate as a foundry is going to take some time, but I think that also definitely requires the certainty of investment. And so if Intel can't successfully develop that foundry capacity, then we're in a whole different problem, because I think to what Xiaoming said, there's a clear incentive on the part of TSMC in Taiwan to not move their leading node, their most sophisticated technology out of the country anytime soon, right? So again, it's clearly made some change in the industry. I would say that it is essential if the goal is to reduce dependency on the region or Taiwan, and overall to alleviate supply chain concerns. And I think it actually does go to your second question, Scott, of how much money are we willing to spend and how much is it going to take? The answer is, if you really want to disentangle, it would take an obscene, completely insane amount of money that I wouldn't spitball. I mean, in the trillions probably, right? Easily probably. And that's just to begin, not to sustain. And so I think that this is kind of your middle place. This is something that's going to have an impact, does not push us into that full industrial policy zone, and then leaves kind of an innovative space and an adaptive space open.
This is bringing this question to everyone, but last year when we were talking about China, at the end, somebody asked the great question of if any of the panelists had a book they recommended on China, and that was great. I'm wondering if you have another book, and I know this puts you on the spot, because if somebody asked me that right now, I'd probably say something by George R.R. Martin, and that's not very helpful. But if there's something that you've been reading that you would recommend to people who are not necessarily China experts, but really need to know this stuff, any thoughts?
I would recommend the book called Digital Silk Road by Heman. I'm forgetting his first name, but I think Digital Silk Road is a really interesting topic. And the book talks about a lot of Huawei's practice along this loosely organized government initiative. I think that's very meaningful to U.S. companies that are watching their Chinese competitors, what they are doing, using their own commercial force, as well as leveraging U.S. Government influence at times to extend their influence overseas. To Sam's earlier point, I think this is area actually U.S. government can do a lot more to be more constructive.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all very much for speaking with us here today. I thought this was really interesting. So join me in thanking the panelists, please. Thank you. And We're going to take a quick break now, and at 10, we'll be back with the Attorneys General, Phil Weiser and Doug Peterson, and one of the few places where a Democrat and Republican actually talk civilly and have interesting conversations. So be back here at 10.